Settle in, dear listener. Let the weight of the day gently lift from your shoulders as you find a comfortable place to rest. Allow your breathing to slow, your thoughts to soften, and your body to grow heavy and still. Tonight, we invite you to journey together across vast stretches of time, far, far back into the earliest chapters of human history, to a land of rivers and reeds, of mud and starlight, where civilization first learned to dream. Close your eyes and let us drift together into the ancient world. For a moment, imagine the air growing warmer, softer, touched with the faint scent of wet clay and river reeds. Imagine a slow wind moving across an immense and quiet plain, carrying with it the distant murmur of water flowing through countless branching channels. Somewhere in the darkness, frogs sing in the marshes. Somewhere above, the sky stretches endlessly, filled with stars that burn with the same calm brilliance they held thousands of years ago. This is the land between the rivers. Long before empires rose and fell, long before marble cities and iron roads, long before even the oldest stories most of us have ever heard, this place was already alive with quiet human activity. Fires glowed in the night beside humble dwellings of mud brick. Boats drifted along slow waterways. And above it all, the stars wheeled slowly in their patient celestial dance. Beneath the warm, whispering plains of southern Mesopotamia, deep within the softly layered mudflats shaped by centuries of flooding rivers, there lie secrets of extraordinary depth. Secrets that gently rearrange everything we believe we understand about how human beings came to build the world they inhabit. The earth here is patient. Every year, the great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, would swell with distant snowmelt from mountains far beyond the horizon. The waters would spill across the plains, spreading thin layers of fine silt that settled softly over everything. And when the floods withdrew again, the land would be renewed, rich, dark, fertile. Year after year, century after century. And slowly, beneath those quiet layers of mud, the traces of human lives accumulated. Walls collapsed. Cities were abandoned. New buildings rose upon the foundations of older ones. The memory of each generation settled gently into the earth. When the first archaeologists arrived at a modest earthen mound, known as Tel Abu Shahin, in the opening decades of the 20th century, they came expecting to find the simple remnants of an early and relatively unsophisticated people. From a distance, the mound itself looked unremarkable. Just a low rise in the otherwise endless flatness of the Mesopotamian plain, a soft hill of sun-baked earth, shaped by wind and time. Local villagers had passed it for generations, without imagining that beneath their feet lay one of the most remarkable archaeological sites in the world. The archaeologists approached with modest expectations. At most, they hoped to uncover the remains of a small farming settlement. Perhaps a scattering of pottery fragments, maybe the outline of a few primitive huts. After all, according to the accepted understanding of human history at the time, the people living here more than 7,000 years ago would have possessed only the simplest forms of social organization. But the earth had other stories to tell. As the first layers of soil were carefully removed, as the slow and patient work of excavation began, something unexpected started to emerge from the deep silence of the ground. Brick. Not random lumps of clay hardened by chance, but bricks shaped deliberately to consistent sizes. Bricks arranged in orderly lines, forming the outlines of structures far more substantial than anyone had expected. And beneath those structures, more layers, older walls, older streets. older foundations. What they discovered instead, hidden beneath drifts of wind-blown sand and the quiet accumulation of ages, was something far more profound and far more perplexing than anyone had dared to imagine. The site, which scholars would eventually identify as the ancient city of Eridu, a place whispered about in the oldest of written records as the very first city ever to exist, revealed an urban sophistication that seemed to belong to an age far later than the soil suggested. To understand why this discovery was so surprising, we must pause for a moment and imagine what archaeologists expected to find. In the traditional story of human development, civilization emerges slowly. First come small groups of wandering hunters and gatherers. Then small farming villages appear. Only after many centuries do those villages grow gradually into towns. And only after many more centuries do true cities, complex centers of trade, religion, administration, and learning, begin to take shape. But Eridu did not seem to follow that script. The deepest levels of the site, those most ancient strata gently compressed beneath everything else, were dated through careful carbon analysis to approximately 5,400 years before the birth of Christ. That alone was remarkable. But what those levels contained was even more astonishing. Instead of the rough shelters and scattered debris of simple hunter-gatherers or small farming communities, the earth gave up evidence of carefully considered neighborhoods, streets laid out with deliberate intention, drainage channels running beneath the ground, brick walls built with standardized measurements, and most striking of all, a temple complex standing at the center of the city. Now imagine that temple for a moment. Not enormous by the standards of later civilizations, perhaps, but precise, balanced, constructed according to careful geometric proportions. Its foundations aligned with surprising accuracy to particular points in the night sky. This last detail puzzled researchers deeply, because the orientation of the temple appeared to correspond with the rising positions of specific groups of stars, something that would require careful astronomical observation over long periods of time. Not days, not months, but generations. And yet, according to the accepted timeline, people living in this region during that period should barely have begun forming permanent settlements. The deeper archaeologists dug, the stranger the story became. Eridu presents the thoughtful observer with a series of deeply layered puzzles. The archaeologists who worked through its soils discovered no fewer than 18 successive phases of building, 18 separate moments across centuries when the inhabitants of the city tore down what had existed before and built anew, each time upon the foundations of the last. Picture that process slowly unfolding across time. A temple is built. Years pass. Generations come and go. Eventually, the building begins to weaken. Walls crack, foundations shift, and so the people carefully dismantle it, brick by brick, and construct a new temple upon the same sacred ground. Then another, and another, each structure rising slightly higher than the one before, slowly creating the layered mound that archaeologists would one day excavate. But even the most ancient of those foundations, the very first temple complex ever constructed upon that sacred ground, and designated by scholars as Temple 1, displays a quality of architectural knowledge that appears not to have grown gradually from simpler efforts. It arrives fully realized, as if carried there from somewhere else entirely. The measurements incorporated into its foundations follow a mathematical system of remarkable precision, a system that, according to the accepted story of human intellectual development, should not have existed for thousands of years more. Yet there it was, quietly embedded in clay and stone, waiting. The temple's orientation connects it deliberately to the rising positions of specific groupings of stars in the night sky, demonstrating a capacity for astronomical observation that implies not a single moment of inspired insight, but generations of patient, methodical watching. Imagine the people who might have stood here in the quiet darkness. Priests, perhaps, or early astronomers, watching the stars rise above the horizon night after night, recording subtle shifts, learning the slow rhythm of the heavens. The same stars we see today, the same silent sky, and the carbon dates from those deepest levels continue, consistently and quietly, to suggest that this sophisticated urban development was already underway during periods when, according to traditional archaeological thinking, human beings were still living as nomadic gatherers with no fixed settlements and no organized society to speak of. It is a gentle contradiction, not dramatic, not loud, but persistent, like a quiet question whispered across thousands of years. And Eridu is not alone in raising such questions. Not far away lies another ancient city, Uruk. If you have ever heard the name of the legendary king Gilgamesh, it is likely that his story is connected in some way to this place. Uruk was immense by ancient standards. Its walls stretched across miles of desert plain. But what lies beneath those walls is perhaps even more intriguing. Deep within its lowest excavated layers, researchers have found evidence of large-scale urban planning, of impressive sophistication. Water management systems, channels directing the flow of river water across the land, holding reservoirs carefully positioned to control flooding, and what appears to be a genuinely early form of hydraulic engineering. Imagine the quiet complexity of such a system. Water entering from distant river channels, guided through carefully constructed canals, stored when necessary, released when fields needed irrigation. It is a delicate balance, one that even modern engineers must carefully manage. And yet the principles embedded in these ancient systems would be instantly recognizable to specialists today. Recovered from those same ancient strata are small clay tablets bearing numerical notations that employ a mathematical system based on the number 60. This system, known today as the sexagesimal system, would later become the hallmark of Sumerian mathematics, and its influence still surrounds us today. Every time we measure an hour as 60 minutes, every time we divide a circle into 360 degrees, we are unknowingly continuing a tradition that began in places like Uruk thousands of years ago. The conceptual complexity embedded in those earliest numerical records suggests a capacity for abstract mathematical thinking that is, by conventional reckoning, simply not supposed to exist in a society of that age. And yet there they are, tiny impressions pressed into wet clay by steady hands, numbers, calculations, records of transactions, quiet evidence of minds already thinking in structured mathematical patterns. Alongside these tablets, pottery fragments exhibit standardized measurements and recurring decorative motifs indicating not the casual output of individual craftspeople working by instinct. Instead, they suggest organized production. Potters working according to established dimensions. Vessels created to consistent specifications. Perhaps even early forms of what we might call quality control. It is the faint beginning of something larger, something systematic, something unmistakably civilized. And the deeper we look, the more these patterns appear. Further south, where the great rivers spread into vast marshlands before meeting the sea, lies the ancient city of Ur. In the early 20th century, archaeologists excavating the royal burial grounds there uncovered treasures so extraordinary that the world briefly turned its attention to this quiet corner of Mesopotamia. Golden helmets, silver vessels, intricate jewelry crafted with astonishing precision. But beyond their beauty, these objects revealed something else. Knowledge, technical knowledge, metallurgical knowledge that seemed strangely advanced for its time. Ceremonial helmets of beaten gold, shaped into lifelike forms. Silver vessels decorated with elegant geometric patterns. Bronze weapons demonstrating an advanced understanding of alloying. The delicate art of combining different metals in precise proportions to achieve particular qualities of strength and flexibility. Such knowledge does not appear overnight. It usually emerges slowly, through generations of experimentation. Yet here it appears already mature, already refined, already mastered. Chemical analysis of these objects revealed something equally intriguing. The metals used to create them came from locations hundreds of miles away, from distant mountains, from faraway mining regions, which means that whoever made these objects was connected to vast trade networks stretching across enormous distances. Caravans moving through deserts, boats traveling along rivers, merchants exchanging goods and knowledge, an entire world quietly humming with activity. And perhaps most intriguing of all are the objects that suggest a deep and systematic fascination with the sky. Among the artifacts recovered from these early Mesopotamian sites are a series of astronomical instruments, bronze discs engraved with star charts, measuring devices designed to track the movements of planets, stone markers positioned at carefully calculated angles, each one part of a quiet, patient effort to understand the heavens. Imagine again those ancient observers, standing on temple terraces at night, watching the slow movement of stars across the sky, recording patterns, predicting cycles, learning slowly the rhythm of the cosmos. The level of accuracy embedded in these instruments rivals, in certain respects, what can be achieved with considerably more modern equipment. And yet they emerge from a period when the people of the region should, by conventional thinking, have been occupied with far more elementary concerns. Perhaps the past is not always as simple as we imagine. Perhaps the story of civilization is more complex, more layered, more mysterious, like the deep soil of Mesopotamia itself. And somewhere within that story lies one of the most intriguing documents ever preserved from the ancient world. A list, a simple list of kings. At first glance, it appears straightforward. But the deeper one looks, the stranger it becomes. It is known today as the Sumerian king list, and it begins with a statement that still echoes quietly across the centuries. When kingship descended from heaven, it was in Eridu. There is something deeply beautiful in the calm certainty of that opening line. It does not hesitate. It does not argue. It does not explain itself. It simply states, with the serene authority of an old tradition, long repeated beside temple walls and under starlit skies, that organized rule, sacred order, and the structure of civilization itself were not invented in confusion by struggling human hands, but lowered gently into the world from above. The document known as the Sumerian King List is one of the most fascinating and disorienting texts to have survived from the ancient world. Compiled from multiple earlier sources during the reign of a ruler named Utu-Hegal around the year 2100, before the Common Era, it opens with a declaration of extraordinary boldness, that kingship itself descended from the heavens, bestowed upon the earth by divine powers. You can imagine, perhaps, a scribe seated in the cool half-light of a temple chamber, Before him rests a tablet of damp clay, smooth and waiting. In his hand, a stylus of reed. Around him, shelves of earlier tablets, lists, records, old stories carried forward across generations. The room is quiet except for the soft scratch of stylus into clay and the distant murmur of people moving through the courtyards outside. He is not inventing, not in the way we think of invention now. He is preserving, gathering, arranging fragments of a memory already ancient in his own day, taking names that had perhaps lived for centuries in ritual recitation and inscribing them into a sequence that would outlast kingdoms. From there, the text proceeds to enumerate a succession of rulers and the lengths of their respective reigns, lengths that, in the section dealing with the period before the Great Flood, stretch credibility to its furthest possible limit. The first 8 kings, those who ruled before the deluge swept across the world, are assigned reigns ranging from just under 19,000 years to more than 43,000. At first encounter, the mind resists such numbers. 43,000 years, 28,000 years, 36,000 years. These figures seem less like history than dream. And so, conventional scholarship has often stepped back from them, gently but firmly, treating them as symbolic exaggerations, poetic magnifications of a distant past. The inevitable tendency, perhaps, of ancient cultures to inflate their beginnings into something vast and luminous. And yet, something in the mathematical structure of those numbers resists being dismissed quite so easily. They are not random, they are not vague, they are not the kind of loose impossibility one might expect from careless myth-making. Instead, they are orderly, measured, patterned. They follow precise numerical relationships embedded in a system based on multiples of 60 and factors that correspond uncannily with astronomical cycles. The very first king of Eridu, a figure named Alulim, is credited with a reign of exactly 28,800 years, which is precisely 480 periods of 60 years each. His successor Alangar ruled for 36,000 years, exactly 600 periods of 60. This kind of deliberate numerical encoding does not resemble the untidy exaggeration of folklore told around a fire. It suggests intention, design, a structure hidden beneath the surface of narrative. Perhaps these numbers were meant to be read differently than we read them now. Perhaps they were never intended as literal human lifespans. Perhaps they preserve something else: astronomical observations, calendrical systems, dynastic cycles, or sacred periods expressed in the only language that could endure intact across cultural collapse: story. There is something deeply ancient in this practice of storing knowledge inside narrative. It is a method older than libraries, older than archives. A way of carrying difficult information across generations by weaving it into forms the human mind remembers naturally. A king, a reign, a city, a flood. The pattern remains even when the original explanation is lost, and the geographical details embedded in the king list align, with striking consistency, with what archaeology has actually uncovered. This, too, is difficult to ignore. The 5 cities named as the homes of the antediluvian rulers, Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sipar, and Shurupak, are precisely the locations where excavation has revealed the earliest and most sophisticated evidence of Sumerian urban development. Again and again, the text points toward real places, not imagined mountains, not unreachable heavens, but cities built in mud and brick beneath the Mesopotamian sky. The mythology and the physical evidence are, in some essential way, pointing to the same ground. And once that happens, once text and earth begin quietly agreeing with one another, the old certainty that myth and history belong to entirely separate worlds begins to soften. Linguistic analysis of the names assigned to these ancient rulers adds another delicate layer to the mystery. Several names carry roots that appear in both later Akkadian and broader Semitic languages, suggesting deep historical continuity. Others display characteristics belonging to what scholars believe may be an even older linguistic layer, predating Sumerian as it is conventionally understood. That last possibility is especially haunting. An older layer, a language beneath the first language, echoes of a people remembered only indirectly through names copied and recopied by later scribes who may no longer have fully understood what those names once meant. The figure of Dumuzi, listed as a king of Bad-Dibira, bears a name that surfaces in many forms across centuries of subsequent Mesopotamian mythology. He becomes shepherd king, divine consort, dying god, seasonal presence woven into ritual and lamentation. Such persistence suggests that whatever memory was being preserved in the king list may have been genuinely historical in nature. Actual rulers whose identity slowly expanded into myth as centuries passed, but whose names remained anchored in cultural memory. This is how deep time often works. A real person becomes a symbol. A ruler becomes a demigod. A city becomes the first city. A flood becomes the flood. And yet, beneath the symbolic layering, there may still remain a core of memory. Worn smooth perhaps, but not entirely erased. The transition between the so-called Ubaid period and the earliest phase of proper Sumerian civilization is one of the most genuinely puzzling episodes in the long story of human development. To appreciate its strangeness, it helps to linger for a moment in the world that came before. The Ubaid culture left behind small villages, agricultural communities, modest houses of mud brick, painted pottery, tools of daily life. The people farmed, fished, built, traded a little, prayed in ways we can only partly recover. Their settlements were real, stable, and meaningful, but comparatively simple. And then something changed. Not gradually, or at least not in the way archaeologists usually expect gradual change to appear. Instead, by the standards of archaeological time, transformation seemed to arrive with startling speed. Cities expanded. Temple institutions took shape. Writing appeared. Metallurgy advanced. Administrative systems emerged. Religious concepts deepened into organized cosmic frameworks. The very relationship between human beings and space changed as settlements became urban worlds structured around sacred and political centers. Conventional models of gradual cultural evolution have always found this transformation difficult to account for. Not impossible, perhaps, but uncomfortably compressed. Too many innovations appear too close together. Too many systems arrive already mature. Archaeological evidence from the transitional period reveals technological innovations appearing simultaneously at multiple sites without the long, messy developmental sequences researchers would normally expect to find. The potter's wheel, bronze metallurgy, complex irrigation systems, large-scale monumental architecture, administrative recording systems, each on its own would represent a significant leap. Together, appearing within so narrow a span of time, they create the impression not of slow and accidental growth, but of acceleration, of knowledge being applied quickly once certain conditions were met. At the site of Tello, the stratification between the latest Ubaid levels and the earliest Sumerian levels is clearly visible, and the gap between them in terms of material sophistication and technological capability, represents an advancement that should, under ordinary circumstances, have required many generations of intermediate experimentation. Yet many of those intermediate stages remain elusive. It is as though the visible record catches civilization, not in its childhood, but in an early adulthood whose infancy occurred elsewhere, or earlier, or under conditions not yet fully understood. Particularly striking, and perhaps most difficult to explain, is the sudden appearance of writing. Writing is one of those inventions that seems, in hindsight, inevitable. Once it exists, it feels obvious, necessary, a natural extension of speech and memory. But in historical reality, writing is an extraordinary threshold. It is the moment when thought begins to leave durable traces outside the mind. And the earliest cuneiform tablets recovered from Uruk do not represent fumbling beginnings. They do not look like hesitant first attempts. They display not primitive pictures scratched vaguely in the direction of meaning, but sophisticated logographic systems capable of recording administrative transactions, religious concepts, and mathematical calculations. They reveal familiarity with categorization, with abstraction, with institutional needs, with the compression of spoken reality into stable visual symbols. Such systems usually require long periods of refinement. Yet the earliest surviving examples already feel practiced, already functional, already embedded in a broader culture of record keeping. No clear precursor stages have been found. No large archive of awkward experiments. No abundant evidence of the long, uncertain path from image to symbol to script. The writing arrives complete, or perhaps only appears complete because the true beginning lies hidden under older layers, or in sites not yet excavated, or in materials more fragile than clay that failed to survive. A lost archive of wood, a painted notation system on reed mats, a body of scribal practice carried orally before being pressed into clay. There are many possibilities. The past is often generous with possibilities and stingy with certainty. Still, the abruptness remains, and the same quality of completeness characterizes the metallurgical achievements of early Sumer. Bronze objects from the earliest Sumerian sites demonstrate mastery of alloying procedures that normally require extensive experimentation to perfect. Different objects show different compositions. Weapons optimized for hardness. Tools balanced for durability. Ceremonial objects shaped for luster and beauty. This is not random mixing. It is applied knowledge. Knowledge that must have been observed, compared, repeated, corrected, and transmitted. Yet the sites that would have preserved the evidence of that long experimentation are, for the most part, silent. The experimentation left few traces, or perhaps its traces lie scattered across landscapes not yet fully explored. Perhaps they were lost in floods, dismantled for later construction, or erased by centuries of occupation. Mesopotamia is a land where water builds and water destroys. What it gives, it may later soften back into mud. And there is another concept at the heart of Sumerian civilization that offers a very different kind of clue. A small word, simple in form, immeasurably rich in meaning. The me. The concept of the me sits at the center of Sumerian religious and political thought. The word is often translated, somewhat imperfectly, as divine powers, decrees, or cosmic laws. Yet none of these translations fully capture its depth. The me were not understood as vague philosophical principles floating abstractly above life. They were specific, potent, transferable realities, forces or frameworks that made civilization possible. Tablets describe them as things that could be possessed, distributed, maintained, lost, stolen, or bestowed. And what is most striking is the range of what they governed. Kingship was a me. Priesthood was a me. Craftsmanship, music, truth, writing, metalwork, mourning, law, weaving, sexual union, judgment, lamentation, architecture, warfare, all were included. It is as though the Sumerians understood civilization not as a single achievement, but as a bundle of interlocking capacities, each one fragile, each one necessary, each one requiring stewardship. The famous poem telling the story of Inanna and the Me describes how the great goddess traveled to the city of Eridu, where the god Enki held these powers in his keeping. Through charm, celebration, and cunning, she acquired them from him and carried them back to Uruk, her own city. It is a beautiful tale on its surface, full of movement, wine, wit, and divine personality. But underneath, it may preserve a memory of something much more concrete. The transfer of institutional knowledge, the movement of systems from one city to another, the spread of administrative, religious, and technical capacities across an emerging urban landscape. The tablets that preserve this story enumerate more than 100 different me, and each one appears to represent not merely an isolated skill, but an entire domain of organized human practice. The me of metallurgy, for example, would not mean simply the ability to melt metal. It would include mining, transport, fuel gathering, furnace construction, smelting temperatures, alloy ratios, craft training, trade networks, ceremonial meanings, temple oversight, storage protocols, distribution systems. In other words, a whole institutional ecology. This is an astonishingly sophisticated way of thinking. It suggests that the Sumerians understood, with great clarity, that complex societies do not function through isolated inventions alone. They function through systems, interdependent, maintained, transmitted systems. Perhaps most revealing is their understanding that the me must be actively preserved. Tablets emphasize again and again that failure to maintain proper ritual observance and institutional continuity results in civilizational decline. Not merely moral decline in a poetic sense, but actual collapse, the erosion of skills, the loss of social order, the failure of agriculture, the weakening of kingship, the fading of memory. This is a remarkably subtle insight. Knowledge systems are not self-sustaining. They do not live automatically. They require libraries, schools, rituals, archives, teachers, apprentices, stable buildings, reliable patronage, and repeated acts of care. When those structures fail, the knowledge they carried begins to fragment. What was once common becomes specialized. What was specialized becomes rare. What was rare becomes myth. And eventually, what once shaped the living world survives only as a story about gods. Archaeological evidence supports this interpretation in quietly compelling ways. Sites described in tablets as having received particular me show corresponding physical evidence of those very activities. Cities associated with agricultural me contain advanced irrigation works and storage systems. Those associated with craft me reveal workshops, kilns, specialized tools, and evidence of long-distance exchange. The correlation between mythological language and physical remains suggests that the me system was not simply theological poetry, it was also a way of organizing and communicating real institutional knowledge. The procedures described in me-related texts for preserving and transmitting knowledge reveal administrative intelligence of a high order. Temple complexes maintained copies of essential texts. Important documents were duplicated and stored in separate locations. Archives were structured to guard against loss. This is not merely reverence for writing, it is strategy. A civilization that has experienced disruption learns to protect its memory. Perhaps that is the key to so much of Mesopotamian thought. The quiet awareness that order is fragile. Floods come, cities burn, dynasties end, canals silt up, yet tablets can survive. If baked by accident in a fire, a clay text may endure for millennia. And so, in the temple libraries of ancient Mesopotamia, rooms filled slowly with wet clay and thought. Shelves gathered names, numbers, hymns, formulas, inventories, star lists, contracts, omens, epics, laws, recipes, prayers, laments. The civilization preserved itself by pressing mind into earth. Among the most perplexing aspects of Sumerian culture is the vast body of texts relating to the divine beings known as the Anunnaki, beings whose name is often translated as those who from heaven came down to earth. There is something inherently arresting in that phrase. It carries distance, descent, authority. The Anunnaki occupy a strange position in the cuneiform literature. They are divine, certainly, but they are not abstract in the way later theology often makes divinity abstract. They possess bodies, households, ranks, tempers, rivalries, responsibilities. They convene councils, make decisions, assign roles, withdraw support, show favor, display something like administration. The line between mythology, historical memory, and technological description becomes difficult to draw with confidence. The Sumerian divine hierarchy operates according to an organizational structure that mirrors earthly political arrangements with startling precision. At its apex stands Anu, described in texts from across the region as supreme authority, a ruler of the heavens whose influence extends to earth below. Tablets from the city of Nippur describe Anu's celestial residence in rich detail, a palace of radiant materials, lapis lazuli halls, meeting chambers, council spaces, storehouses, and workshops. Even if we read such descriptions symbolically, their structure remains revealing. The divine realm is imagined not as pure chaos or formless spirit, but as an ordered institutional world. There are chambers for assembly, spaces for decision-making, areas for production, systems of communication. Descriptions include references to devices for observing distant places, methods of communicating across great spans, and manufacturing processes associated with extraordinary precision. Whether we choose to interpret these as poetic metaphors, theological imagination, echoes of misunderstood technology, or some mixture of all three, their consistency across independent sources is striking. Enlil, the second great figure in this hierarchy, functions as administrator of divine authority, the Lord of Command, the one who implements order. In the Epic of Atrahasis and other texts, Enlil appears as the organizer of large-scale projects, the manager of population, the enforcer of cosmic balance. The references to his tablets of destiny are especially curious. These are not presented as inert records, but as objects possessing operative power, devices or decrees through which destinies are assigned, legitimacies confirmed, futures stabilized. Again, interpretation remains open. Yet the conceptual structure suggests something more systematized than vague myth. It feels bureaucratic in the deepest possible sense. Authority embodied in controlled records. Enki, the third great figure, perhaps most vividly embodies the union of sacred imagination and technical association. Lord of the earth, of subterranean waters, of wisdom, craft, and creative intelligence, he appears throughout the literature as a master of innovation. He builds, designs, calculates, advises, rescues, modifies, creates. The Atrahasis epic describes Enki's role in the creation of humankind through a process involving clay mixed with the essence of living beings. To a modern reader, this description can feel surprisingly suggestive, not because it proves anything literal about advanced science, but because it frames creation in procedural rather than purely miraculous terms. There are materials, ingredients, steps, a workshop logic. Tablets from Eridu, Enki's primary cult center, contain descriptions of facilities associated with his presence. Chambers, instruments, repositories, controlled spaces. Whether these reflect ritualized symbolism or dim memories of highly specialized environments, they reveal a culture deeply comfortable imagining wisdom as something spatial, procedural, and materially enacted. And then there are the cylinder seals. These small carved objects, rolled across wet clay, produced continuous narrative scenes of astonishing density. Gods, humans, animals, processions, rituals, banquets, offerings, celestial symbols, all compressed into miniature visual worlds. Seals from the early dynastic period consistently depict tall figures wearing distinctive headgear and elaborate garments interacting with smaller human figures. The scale difference may well be symbolic, as ancient art often uses size to indicate status. Yet, the consistency with which certain forms recur has long invited wonder. One especially intriguing seal shows a tall figure leaning over a reclining human form, while attendants carry containers and tools. To modern eyes, the scene can resemble some kind of procedure. Of course, resemblance is not proof. Ancient ritual and modern technology often appear strangely similar when stripped of context, but the careful detail of these images continues to provoke reflection. Even the craftsmanship of the seals themselves is remarkable. They required fine cutting tools, a steady hand, microscopic precision, and a mental ability to compose a scene that would only appear correctly when rolled in reverse across clay. Such objects are not casual products. They belong to a civilization already deeply practiced in precision, symbolism, and repeatable image making. The flood narrative, which appears in Mesopotamian literature in multiple forms, carries within it another resonance that refuses to fade. Flood stories exist in many cultures, yes. Water is among the oldest of human fears. Rivers nourish and destroy. Seas swallow. Storms erase. And yet the Mesopotamian flood tradition feels distinct in its technical texture. The version preserved in the Epic of Gilgamesh describes the catastrophic deluge in detail. The warning, the vessel, its measurements, its waterproofing, its loading, the violence of the waters, the release of birds, the settling upon a mountain. It reads, in places, less like pure allegory than like remembered procedure. Geological evidence from Mesopotamian river systems has indeed revealed sediment layers associated with severe flooding events, and climatic data from beyond the region suggests periods of abrupt environmental instability. The correspondence is not exact enough to collapse myth into geology, but it is close enough to keep the old story grounded in lived possibility. Imagine the delta in flood. The flatness of the land offering no shelter. Villages vanishing beneath brown water. Boats torn from their moorings. Grain stores ruined. Canals swallowed back into open floodplain. The sky black for days. The rivers no longer rivers, but one endless moving sheet. A catastrophe like that would survive in memory, passed from grandparent to child, reduced perhaps, then expanded, joined to divine anger, cosmic reset, new beginnings. The departure of the Anunnaki from direct involvement in human affairs represents, in Sumerian historical consciousness, one of the great turning points in the story of civilization. What is so striking is that this departure is not usually framed as a sudden vanishing. Rather, it appears as a withdrawal, gradual, deliberate, managed. Institutional frameworks are left in place. Kingship is re-established. Cities continue. Ritual order persists, but now with a different distance between heaven and earth. The Sumerian king list marks this transition with extraordinary brevity. The flood swept over the earth, and when kingship was again lowered from heaven, it was found in Kish. Everything before and after hinges on that sentence. Disruption, then re-establishment. The old order broken, a new order granted. And yet the governmental structures that appear in the post-flood period display a sophistication suggesting continuity rather than reinvention. Early dynastic rulers commanded administrative systems, legal habits, professional classes, and technological traditions that look inherited. They do not seem to be inventing society from nothing. They are stepping into already formed institutional pathways. Royal archives from places like Uruk preserve records of property, labor, trade, and instruction whose complexity implies generations of prior development. This is one of the central impressions that ancient Mesopotamia gives us again and again. Not origin as simplicity, but origin as maturity. Not a hesitant first step, but an entrance already in motion. And nowhere is that more evident than in the great ziggurats. From a distance, a ziggurat appears almost simple. A stepped mountain of brick rising above the flat plain. But close examination reveals astonishing sophistication. These structures dominated their cities. They gathered light. They commanded attention. They reoriented the human eye vertically. In a land where the horizon is broad and low, the ziggurat created artificial elevation, a meeting point between earth and sky. Recent architectural analysis of Mesopotamian temple platforms has revealed carefully calculated alignments, observation angles, and spatial relationships that support the idea that these were not merely symbolic towers, but functional astronomical spaces as well. Platforms positioned for viewing particular star risings, markers aligned with cardinal directions, floor points corresponding to celestial coordinates. The orientation of major structures often aligns with true north and with solar or stellar events to a degree of accuracy that demands deliberate surveying. Imagine standing atop such a structure before dawn. The city below still mostly asleep, the air cool, the first pale line of light appearing along the horizon. A priest astronomer watches a specific star rise at the edge of the world, precisely where it should, precisely when it should. A record is made. Another point is added to a chain of observations perhaps already centuries old. This is not romantic speculation. It is the logical implication of the evidence. Astronomy requires patience more than genius. It demands continuity, night after night, year after year, generation after generation. The mathematical knowledge preserved in Sumerian cuneiform tablets reveals intellectual achievements whose influence on subsequent human civilization is almost impossible to overstate. The base 60 system appears in the earliest surviving tablets in fully developed form, and the choice of 60 is itself a quiet masterpiece. 60 is highly divisible. It can be split evenly in many ways, making it ideal for fractions, ratios, and calculations involving time, space, and geometry. It is a number well suited to practical reality. Mathematical tablets from Nippur and elsewhere contain not only basic accounting, but solutions to advanced problems, geometric relations, quadratic procedures, sophisticated approximations, patterned calculations that suggest formal training. One famous tablet records the square root of 2 with striking precision. Another preserves what appears to be a form of trigonometric reasoning. These achievements emerge far earlier than traditional intellectual history once expected, and they do so not as isolated marvels, but as products of a scribal culture that trained minds systematically. A student in a temple school would have copied tables, repeated operations, memorized sequences, solved increasingly complex exercises, hour after hour in quiet rooms, clay after clay after clay. There is something deeply moving in that image, the continuity of human concentration across millennia. A child once sat beneath a Mesopotamian roof, shaping numbers into clay, while sunlight moved slowly across the floor. That child is gone. The building is dust, the city is ruin. Yet the tablet remains, and with it, the faint trace of a mind at work. Astronomical observations preserved in cuneiform tablets likewise demonstrate accuracy that implies long durations of careful watching. Star positions, planetary cycles, eclipse patterns, calendrical corrections. All of these require records, comparison, and institutional persistence. The synchronization of solar and lunar cycles alone is no trivial matter. To maintain a calendar that keeps months, seasons, agriculture, ritual, and administration aligned requires intercalation procedures, mathematical adjustment, and ongoing observation. Such systems do not survive without specialized people responsible for them. And perhaps most remarkable is the evidence suggesting an awareness of long-term celestial drift, what we now call the precession of the equinoxes. Whether the Sumerians themselves fully conceptualized this in the way later astronomers would is still debated. But traditions preserved in Mesopotamian astronomical records point toward awareness of extremely long celestial cycles. The reported value for the complete precessional cycle, 25,920 years, is strikingly close to modern calculation. Even if such figures emerged through accumulated tradition, rather than direct theoretical explanation, they imply something extraordinary, either exceptionally long continuity of observation or computational methods of astonishing subtlety. The medical knowledge preserved in Sumerian tablets opens yet another quiet chamber in this labyrinth of early sophistication. A diagnostic manual recovered from Nippur describes symptoms, classifications, and treatments for a large number of conditions. Some diagnoses are framed in spiritual or divinatory language, of course. Ancient medicine rarely separates body and cosmos as sharply as modern medicine does. And yet alongside the ritual elements appear clear empirical observations. Symptoms are compared. Conditions are distinguished. Prognoses are offered. Procedures are prescribed. The anatomical detail in some texts suggests repeated, careful familiarity with the human body. Surgical procedures are described for injuries, stones, cataracts, and trauma. Bronze instruments recovered archaeologically resemble the tools such procedures would require. Again, one must be cautious. Precision of description does not automatically mean universal practice. Some texts may preserve ideals more than common realities. Yet even as ideals, they reveal what was imaginable and what was teachable. Pharmaceutical preparations described in these texts include plant compounds, minerals, oils, resins, and processed substances that modern pharmacology recognizes as genuinely active. Extraction, boiling, mixing, filtering, grinding, infusing, these are procedural verbs, not magical abstractions. Ancient Mesopotamian healers lived in the overlap between ritual and experiment, where prayer and preparation coexisted without contradiction. The urban infrastructure of Sumerian cities reveals similar layers of organized capability: houses with drainage, streets with planning, storage systems, workshop districts, standardized brick sizes, public and sacred spaces arranged in relation to one another. Even the brick itself tells a story. Mud mixed with straw, pressed into molds, dried in sun, sometimes baked, made again and again to consistent proportions. A city is repetition made durable. Thousands of similar actions coordinated over time. Thousands of bricks, each one small on its own, together creating walls, courtyards, stairways, ramps, terraces, administrative rooms, kitchens, shrines, archive chambers, schools. Mass production evidence from pottery workshops at Uruk suggests coordinated manufacturing in sequential stages. One worker prepares clay, another shapes, another smooths, another fires, another decorates or inspects. There is already labor differentiation, already process management, already the logic of organized production. The temple complexes that stood at the heart of Sumerian cities were far more than places of worship. They were institutions in the fullest sense: economic centers, archive houses, schools, redistribution hubs, ceremonial stages, observatories, workshops, and administrative engines. The temple complex at Nippur provides some of the clearest evidence for this integrated character. Its scribal school contained thousands of practice tablets, mathematical exercises, word lists, model contracts, literary passages. Students were not merely learning to write, they were being inducted into the machinery of civilization itself. Adjacent spaces were used for craft activities and storage. Libraries accumulated texts across centuries. Archives organized records not only for devotion, but for governance. In such places, the sacred and the practical were not separate domains. The cosmos, the city, the canal, the grain measure, the hymn, the eclipse, the labor roster, all belonged to one continuous order. Scribal training programs documented in temple archives reveal curricula requiring many years to complete. Students progressed from basic signs to lexical lists, from accounting to literature, from simple numeracy to advanced computation. The most skilled became guardians of hidden knowledge. Astronomical procedures, ritual formulae, technical operations, specialist vocabularies. The institutional framework that sustained such education was itself one of Sumer's greatest achievements. It is easy, perhaps, to admire a gold helmet or a star chart. Harder, but equally important, is to admire the schoolroom that made such things possible. A civilization survives through its classrooms, through dull repetition, through corrected mistakes, through patient copying, through the quiet decision that certain things must not be forgotten. And yet forgotten they often were. The Akkadian conquest of Sumerian city-states around 2334 before the Common Era marked the beginning of a slow process of erosion. Not immediate annihilation, not total darkness all at once, but a fraying. Sargon of Akkad's campaigns appear to have targeted temple complexes strategically, which makes sense. In Mesopotamia, Power was not held only by kings and palaces, but by institutions that controlled grain, labor, literacy, ritual, and technical knowledge. Archaeological evidence from conquest layers reveals destruction in archive rooms and workshop areas. Some tablets were burned, others broken, others scattered. Fire, ironically, may have saved many texts by baking them hard enough to survive. Thus, destruction becomes preservation. An archive burns, the building collapses, the empire passes, and thousands of years later, the baked tablets emerge from the ash still bearing their signs. The administrative system installed by the Akkadians altered the relationship between power and expertise. Military command replaced some of the earlier temple-centered structures. Specialized craftsmen were redirected. Educational continuity weakened. Translation across languages introduced simplifications. Technical vocabularies blurred. This is how knowledge begins to fade, not usually through one dramatic loss, but through substitutions. A specific term replaced by a general one. A master dies without a student. A workshop changes function. An archive is no longer maintained. A ritual is shortened. A table copied with one small numerical error. A building left unrepaired after flood damage. Each loss appears manageable. Together, over generations, they become irreversible. Babylonian efforts to preserve earlier traditions were sincere and often brilliant. Babylon inherited enormous portions of Sumerian knowledge, especially in mathematics, astronomy, law, and literature. Yet inheritance is not the same as origin. Some procedures survived even when their deepest rationale had grown faint. A formula can be copied without being fully understood. A ritual can be performed long after its initial context is gone. A number can be transmitted as sacred or traditional, even when the chain of observation that produced it has weakened. Mechanical preservation without comprehension is fragile. Assyrian military campaigns added further disruption. Libraries were assembled, yes, most famously by Ashurbanipal, whose great archive at Nineveh preserved vast quantities of Mesopotamian literature. Yet the preservation itself often changed the status of what was preserved. Texts became antiquities, treasures, objects of royal accumulation, historical records. The archive saved them, but also transformed them. What was once living technical culture became, increasingly, heritage. And still later, as new religious and imperial structures took shape, ancient knowledge encountered other forms of pressure. Pagan schools closed, temple systems dissolved, scribal languages died, libraries were neglected, repurposed, dismantled, or destroyed. The world turned. Scripts changed. The gods of one age became the demons or metaphors of another. Yet not everything vanished. The translation movement within Islamic civilization preserved and extended major strands of ancient knowledge with profound intelligence and care. Through Arabic scholarship, many mathematical, astronomical, and medical traditions descended from Mesopotamian and related ancient sources found new life. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad was not merely a place of copying, but of active research and synthesis. Data was compared, methods extended. Ancient knowledge became usable again within new frameworks. And still, much had already been lost before these preservation efforts began. The most sophisticated practical capabilities of early Mesopotamian civilization, certain precision crafts, institutional ecologies, integrated knowledge systems, appear to have fragmented long before they could be systematically transmitted intact. What remains then are fragments. Fragments of astonishing brilliance, enough to suggest a civilization far richer than the old simplified timelines once allowed, enough to inspire wonder, enough to keep drawing human curiosity back toward the mudflats of southern Mesopotamia, where the earliest cities rose from reeds and clay beneath immense skies. And perhaps that is part of why the rediscovery of cuneiform in the 19th century had such a powerful effect on the modern imagination. When scholars finally learned to read those wedge-shaped impressions again, an entire buried world began slowly speaking. At first, only in pieces. A royal name, a tax list, a hymn. Then more. Flood stories older than Genesis. Kings before the flood. Goddesses carrying the powers of civilization from one city to another. Astronomical texts, mathematical tables, medical procedures, myths that felt less like childish fantasies than like worn vessels carrying compressed memory. The decipherment of cuneiform did more than expand historical knowledge. It unsettled chronology. It complicated origins. It revealed that some of the foundational patterns of later civilization, timekeeping, law, urban administration, writing, sacred kingship, technical instruction, had roots reaching deeper than many had imagined. No wonder so many esoteric, mystical, and alternative traditions became fascinated with Sumer. Once a door like that opens, many kinds of people walk through it. Some seek scholarly understanding. Some seek spiritual lineage. Some seek hidden technologies, forbidden histories, evidence of lost worlds or non-human visitors. Not all such interpretations hold up to careful scrutiny. Many go far beyond the evidence. Yet the persistence of such fascination tells us something important. Sumer feels unfinished. Its surviving record contains too many mature beginnings, too many elegant systems appearing too early, too many fragments suggesting larger wholes now gone. Modern archaeology continues to uncover new questions. Sites far beyond southern Mesopotamia, such as Göbekli Tepe, have already pushed back the timeline of organized monument building and ritual complexity by thousands of years, proving that human sophistication has deeper roots than older models assumed. Remote sensing, satellite imagery, chemical analysis, microscopic tool studies, and digital catalogs of tablet collections continue to refine the picture. Trade routes appear longer. Manufacturing seems subtler. Landscape organization more extensive. Mathematical patterns more intricate. The old story grows softer at the edges, less certain, more spacious, and perhaps that is appropriate. The beginnings of civilization should not feel too neat. They should feel damp with river mist, half hidden, stratified, part memory, part measurement, clay under fingernails, starlight over temple stairs, names copied across centuries, knowledge appearing, vanishing, returning in fragments. Southern Mesopotamia still holds much beneath its soil. Unexcavated mounds rise quietly across the plain. Some have never been touched. Others were only partly explored by early archaeologists using methods far less precise than those available now. Ground-penetrating radar suggests buried structures. Old satellite imagery reveals pale geometric traces beneath fields and desert crust. The land remains full of unopened rooms. And even among what has already been found, so much remains unread, untranslated, or only partially understood. Thousands upon thousands of tablets lie in museum drawers and storage collections, each one potentially carrying some small clarification, some technical term, some overlooked correspondence, some line that alters the shape of a whole debate. There is humility in this. The past is not finished just because it is old. It continues to change as we learn to see it better. And so the forbidden secrets of Sumerian civilization, if secrets they truly are, may never be fully recovered in any complete sense. But their influence persists through fragments, through math, through timekeeping, through the architecture of administration, through sacred stories, through astrology and astronomy, through law and lament, through the simple human instinct to write things down so they will outlast us. The mud of southern Mesopotamia holds its secrets gently, patiently, in the deep and ancient dark. Some of them have been coaxed into the light. Others remain where they have always been, waiting beneath layers of wind-blown sand and time, for the right question to be asked in the right place. And if you listen very softly, in the quiet between thoughts, you can almost imagine that world still there. A canal reflecting stars. A temple stair cooling under moonlight. A scribe blowing gently across fresh clay. A distant drum sounding across the sleeping city. Reeds whispering at the river's edge. The smell of bitumen, grain, warm earth, smoke. A child asleep beneath a woven mat roof, while somewhere nearby an old priest watches the heavens and makes a mark that will matter centuries later. Everything is still now. The cities are gone, yet not gone. They rest beneath the earth in layers, each one carrying the shape of human effort. Walls, altars, drains, workshops, courtyards, kitchens, schools. All the ordinary and extraordinary parts of life pressed together in silence. And perhaps that is what makes Mesopotamia so moving. Not only that it may have been the cradle of cities, or the birthplace of writing, or the keeper of early mathematics, but that its people, like us, lived between fragility and order. They tried to make permanence in a world of floodwater. They tried to remember in a world that forgets. They raised towers toward stars they could never reach, and they pressed meaning into mud because stone was scarce and life was short and memory was precious. They understood, perhaps more clearly than many later civilizations, that everything built by human hands is vulnerable, but that vulnerability itself can become sacred if one tends to it carefully enough. A library is sacred because it can burn. A canal is sacred because it can clog. A harvest is sacred because it can fail. A city is sacred because it can vanish. And knowledge is sacred because it can be lost. So the ancient world of Sumer lingers not merely as a puzzle, nor only as a source of strange claims and enduring debates, but as a soft and steady reminder that civilization is always both miracle and maintenance. A thing lowered from heaven, perhaps, and also a thing repaired each day by tired human hands. Now let those thoughts begin to loosen. Let the names grow softer. Eridu, Uruk, Ur, Nippur, Shurupak. Let them drift like lanterns on dark water, slowly moving away. Let the kings and temples and flood stories recede into mist. Let the tablets be stacked quietly back in their chambers. Let the stars continue their slow turning over the plain. There is nothing you need to solve tonight. No mystery asks anything of you. The rivers can keep their patient course in the dark. The old cities can sleep beneath their blankets of earth. And you, dear listener, can rest. Because the story will remain. The mudflats will remain. The stars will remain. And somewhere beneath the long silence of time, the first city still dreams. In that first city, if first city it truly was, morning would have come slowly. Not with the hard edges of modern waking, not with clocks and alarms and sudden electric brightness, but by degrees. a paling in the eastern sky, the quiet fading of stars near the horizon, the first chill movement of air across the reeds. Somewhere, a bird lifting its call into the dimness. Somewhere, a dog stirring in the dust. Somewhere, a woman rising before dawn to tend a small fire, to warm grain, to begin the patient sequence of tasks by which another day would be made. And over everything, the soft shape of the temple. Even in darkness, people would have known where it stood. The temple did not disappear at night. It remained as presence, as outline, as certainty. By day, its brick caught the sun. By night, it held the stars above its angles and terraces, a silent geometry against the open sky. It is easy, perhaps, to imagine ancient life only in grand forms. Kings, priests, treasures, inscriptions, rituals beneath moonlight. But every city, even the most mysterious one, is also made of ordinary rhythms. Footsteps in damp earth, water carried in jars, grain measured, nets mended, children hushed to sleep. A cracked wall repaired with fresh mud, a doorway swept, a loom set upright, a boat pulled toward shore by hand. Civilization begins not only in wonder, but in repetition. And Mesopotamia, perhaps more than any early landscape we know, was a place where repetition mattered. The rivers rose and fell in cycles. Canals had to be cleared again and again. Silt was blessing and burden at once. Brick dissolved if neglected. Boundaries shifted. Channels wandered. The land offered abundance, but only to those willing to manage its moods with patience. This is one reason the emergence of organized life here feels so meaningful. It was not built in a stable paradise. It was built in a place of immense fertility, yes, but also constant maintenance. The world had to be watched. Water had to be directed. Foundations had to be renewed. Knowledge had to be remembered, because forgetting had immediate consequences. A city in such a place becomes a kind of shared act of concentration. Imagine the canal workers before sunrise, moving with baskets and tools to clear accumulated reeds and mud from the watercourses. Imagine supervisors measuring labor. Imagine scribes noting grain allotments. Imagine the sound of wet earth being cut and lifted. All of this before the sun had fully climbed above the flat edge of the world. Then, later, the market sounds. Voices in exchange. Pottery stacked in rows. Fish laid out in the morning coolness. Bundles of reeds. Cloth. Dates. Copper ingots brought from far away. Resins. Oils. Stones. The small active hum by which a city reminds itself that it is alive. And behind these visible rhythms lies the invisible structure that made them possible. Records, agreements, expectations, categories, calendars, inherited practices, trained hands. This is why writing mattered so much in Sumer, and why its early appearance remains so astonishing. Writing did not emerge here first as poetry, though poetry would eventually reach magnificent heights. It emerged in close relationship to management, counting, recording, assigning, remembering who owed what, who delivered what when the grain came in, how much wool had been distributed, which workers belonged to which institution. There is something very tender, in its own way, about these earliest uses of writing, because they reveal not only administration, but anxiety, the fear of loss, the knowledge that memory is imperfect, the need to make a mark that will still mean something tomorrow. A token is one kind of memory. A spoken agreement is another. But a clay tablet, once impressed and dried, becomes a steadier witness. It sits. It waits. It says, calmly, this happened. this amount, this person, this date, this obligation, this offering, this boundary. And once such marks exist, the world begins to change around them. A scribe becomes possible, an archive becomes possible, a debt extended across time becomes possible, a kingdom in a deeper sense becomes possible. Perhaps that is part of what is meant when the king list says that kingship descended from heaven. Not merely a ruler with a crown, but the whole architecture of legitimacy, continuity, succession, and record. The right to say not only who rules now, but who ruled before, and by what order that authority continues. This is why lists matter so much in Mesopotamian civilization. King lists, lexical lists, offerings lists, star lists, lists of professions, lists of omens. Lists are a form of order, a way of laying the world into sequences that can be held in the mind and passed to the next generation. One can almost imagine a young scribe, not yet fully skilled, sitting cross-legged in the dust-cooled room of a temple school, copying such lists again and again. Tree, reed, ox, sheep, grain, temple, king, field, canal, star. The stylus presses wedge after wedge into the damp surface. Mistakes are smoothed and corrected. The teacher watches. Outside, sunlight brightens the courtyard. The child may not yet understand the vast system into which he is being initiated, but his hand is learning the shapes that hold the city together. This slow education may be among the greatest hidden achievements of Sumer. Not only the invention of writing, but the decision to teach it systematically, to reproduce expertise intentionally, to build institutions in which knowledge would outlast any one body. And yet even here, in this admirable order, there is always vulnerability. Clay can break, schools can close, languages can die. A sign once obvious can become obscure in the space of a few generations if the training chain is interrupted. That is one reason the survival of cuneiform texts feels almost miraculous. So much of what ancient Mesopotamia knew was entrusted to a medium both humble and surprisingly durable. Clay is not precious. It does not gleam like gold. It does not inspire awe in the same immediate way carved stone might. But clay, once baked, can endure flood, ruin, burial, neglect. What seems fragile may last longer than what seems grand. There is a lesson in that. The soft thing survives. The simple medium carries the deepest memory, and beneath the great interpretive debates about chronology, astronomy, gods, kings, flood traditions, lost technologies, there remains this quiet material truth. Human beings took wet earth and pressed their minds into it. The act itself is almost unbearably intimate. Finger and stylus, thought and mud. A line from the invisible made visible. A moment of consciousness translated into marks durable enough to cross 5,000 years. If one pauses long enough with that fact, the distance between present and past begins to feel less absolute. The people of ancient Sumer are strange to us. Yes, their cosmology differs from ours. Their language, their rituals, their assumptions about divine order belong to another world. And yet a person once paused over a tablet and worried about accuracy. Someone once copied carefully because getting it right mattered. Someone once made a correction, or sighed at a mistake, or felt pride in clean lines. These are recognitions the body understands immediately, across time. The same can be said of their relationship with the sky. For all the complexity of Sumerian astronomy, For all the mathematical sophistication later associated with Mesopotamian star lore, the foundation of it remains wonderfully simple. People looked up. Night after night, they looked up. In a land where the horizon is wide and the sky often clear, the heavens dominate perception. The stars do not feel distant in such places. They feel governing. Their risings and settings structure expectation. Their regularity offers reassurance in a world where rivers may fail or overflow, dynasties may change, disease may come without warning. To watch the sky attentively is not merely a scientific act in such a culture. It is devotional, practical, political, agricultural, existential. A star that rises at a certain season might signal planting time. A planet appearing in an unusual relation to another might invite ritual concern. An eclipse might unsettle a king. A calendar out of alignment could disrupt offerings, labor cycles, or tax expectations. The heavens were not decorative. They were woven into the operational life of the city. That is why the precision of Sumerian and later Mesopotamian astronomical records matters so much. It reflects not idle curiosity, but sustained necessity. Imagine a rooftop or temple platform at night. Below, the city is settling into sleep. A few lamps still glow. Somewhere dogs bark and then fall quiet. The canals hold dark reflections. And above, the stars move with such slowness that only long attention reveals their change. The observer is patient. He has inherited records from those before him. He knows where to look. He marks the moment a particular star clears the horizon. He notes the timing relative to the moon. He compares it to prior observations. And though he cannot know it in modern terms, he participates in one of the oldest continuous scientific traditions on Earth. This combination of devotion and precision gives ancient Mesopotamian thought much of its special atmosphere. It does not divide the world as sharply as we often do now. Technical skill and sacred meaning intertwine. Mathematics and ritual share space. Administration and cosmology are neighbors. To manage the city well is, in some sense, to align it with a greater order. This is visible too in architecture. The temple is not only a religious site, it is a statement about placement, a way of fixing the human world in relation to cardinal directions, celestial events, divine presence, and social hierarchy. It rises above houses not simply to dominate, but to orient. A person walking through the city knows where they are by reference to it. Perhaps that is another meaning hidden within the me, not just powers or domains, but orientations. Ways of structuring life so that each activity belongs somewhere in relation to all the others. Weaving belongs here. Judgment belongs here. Music belongs here. Kingship belongs here. Metalwork belongs here. Lamentation belongs here. Each thing held in relation to every other thing. A civilization built from placement rather than accident. This may be why loss appears so dramatically in Mesopotamian texts. When order fails, it is not merely inconvenience, it is disorientation. The me are dispersed. The rites are neglected. The king loses favor. The canals clog. The city weakens. Foreign armies enter. The gods depart from their shrines. Everything begins to slip from its proper place. There are laments from Mesopotamia that are among the most haunting documents the ancient world has left us. City laments. Temple laments. Songs for ruined places. They are not abstract meditations on sadness. They are specific grief for institutions, walls, sanctuaries, storehouses, streets, and rituals interrupted. The lament over Ur, for example, feels almost unbearable in its tenderness. A once great city is imagined desolate, its people scattered, its sacred order broken. The divine figures themselves mourn. Dust settles where offerings once stood. Silence fills rooms once alive with chant. To read such texts is to understand how deeply ancient Mesopotamians cared about continuity. A city was not merely infrastructure, it was memory arranged in space. And because it was memory, its loss was spiritual as well as practical. This makes the archaeological record feel strangely emotional, once one has sat with it long enough. A broken wall is not just a wall. It is the edge of a room where someone once learned signs. A collapsed drain is not just engineering. It is part of the daily effort that kept the city habitable. A tablet listing grain rations is not just bureaucracy. It is evidence that real people ate because someone recorded correctly. An astronomical notation is not just a number. It is a night of human attention now folded into silence. Perhaps this is why the mysteries of Sumer have retained such power in the modern imagination. Not only because they raise unanswered questions, but because they offer us the rare experience of feeling civilization at once deeply familiar and profoundly strange. We recognize the city. We recognize school, law, labor, memory, calculation, repair. And yet the frame within which all these existed, the divine councils, the me, the temple economies, the cosmic descent of kingship, feels distant enough to create wonder. It is a mirror, but a dark and ancient one, reflecting us back in altered form. The fascination with the Anunnaki, for instance, often says as much about modern longing as it does about ancient texts. People sense correctly that something in early Mesopotamian civilization exceeds simplistic developmental stories. They feel the presence of mature systems appearing very early. They notice the peculiar mixture of technical detail and divine narrative. And into that space of uncertainty, they pour many interpretations. Some see extraterrestrials. Some see lost advanced civilizations. Some see symbolic theology read too literally. Some see collective memory of real elites gradually mythologized. Some see all ancient gods as coded astronomy. Some reject all unusual interpretations entirely. The truth may remain more elusive, and perhaps more interesting, than any single theory allows. Ancient texts are rarely one thing only. A flood story may preserve geological memory, ritual significance, moral reflection, and political meaning all at once. A divine figure may be a god, an ancestral ruler, a celestial principle, and a memory of institutional power layered together. A temple may be both observatory and sanctuary without contradiction. The modern desire to separate categories cleanly can sometimes make the ancient world harder to understand rather than easier. In Sumer, categories live together. That is why the literature breathes so differently from many later traditions. A text can move from administrative detail to cosmic declaration, with no sense of change in register. The same civilization that calculated fields and labor quotas also told of goddesses carrying the powers of civilization from city to city by boat. And perhaps that image is worth lingering with for a little while. Inanna on the river, her vessel moving across dark water, the me secured within it. The powers of kingship, music, judgment, craft and language, traveling from Eridu to Uruk. Whatever else this story may mean, it is also a beautiful way of imagining culture itself. Civilization as something transportable, but only with care. A cargo both practical and sacred. A fragile inheritance crossing uncertain water. How many times in human history has some version of that voyage occurred? Books carried out of burning cities, teachers fleeing with memory intact, craftsmen taking their skills to a new court, astronomical records copied before the archive is destroyed, a language preserved in prayer after it has vanished from the street. The voyage of the me never truly ended. It continues whenever knowledge survives disruption. And perhaps this helps explain the peculiar power of Mesopotamia's afterlife. Though its cities fell, though its language ceased to be spoken, though its temple systems vanished, portions of its thought moved outward through other civilizations. Into Babylon, into Assyria, into the Hellenistic world, into late antique astronomy, into Islamic scholarship, into the divisions of the hour and the circle, into flood stories retold in other sacred books, into legal traditions, omen lore, celestial mapping, timekeeping, and the old human habit of reading significance in the patterned sky. Even its losses continued to shape the future. What disappears leaves contours. What cannot be fully recovered becomes a source of longing, speculation, reconstruction. This is part of why every new excavation in Mesopotamia feels charged with more than academic interest. A newly uncovered room, a fresh set of tablets, a previously unexamined residue in a ceremonial vessel. Any of these might shift a debate. Any might clarify how early a given technique existed, how far trade routes extended, how precisely a text should be translated, whether some long-dismissed detail contains more substance than previously thought. And yet, archaeology proceeds slowly, brushstroke by brushstroke, layer by layer. The earth is not hurried. Perhaps that is fitting for a civilization so concerned with patience. To excavate Mesopotamia well is to honor its tempo. One does not rush a tell, that great mound of accumulated living. Each layer may belong to a different century, a different political arrangement, a different dialect, a different phase of the same temple, a different generation solving the same old problem of how to stay in right relation with water, sky, and one another. The mound itself becomes a kind of physical memory palace. At the top, perhaps, later occupations. Below them, older walls. Below them, burnt layers. Below them, rebuilt shrines. Below them, the first outlines of an urban plan. Below them, marsh-edge dwellings and the earliest mud bricks. Below them, perhaps still older traces not yet reached. Every spade enters time. Every trench is a conversation with compression. This too is dreamlike in its way. To think that a city does not vanish so much as settle into itself. One life above another. One wall resting on the remains of the wall before it. Human time becoming geology. No wonder ancient Mesopotamia lends itself so naturally to sleep stories and quiet contemplation. Its truths are layered truths. Nothing appears all at once. The more one sinks into it, the more the firm surface of ordinary history gives way to something deeper, softer, stranger. A first city that did not feel like a beginning. A writing system that arrived already practiced. A king list where time stretches into impossible magnitudes. A mathematics too elegant to fit neatly into old models. A cosmology in which the architecture of society is spoken of as divine cargo. A flood remembered across multiple civilizations. A body of knowledge preserved in humble clay. A people whose closeness to fragility made them masters of maintenance, and all of it born in mud. There is profound poetry in that last fact. Not marble, not mountain stone, not cedar forests or cool granite plateaus. Mud. River mud. soft earth shaped by hand. The first great cities rose where the ground itself could not be trusted to remain fixed. Their builders worked with a material that cracked, softened, and demanded renewal. And perhaps because of that, they understood something permanent societies often forget, that continuity is not the natural state of things. It must be made and remade. A brick wall in Sumer was already a philosophy. It said, "We know this will need repair. We build anyway." A canal said, "Water wanders. We guide it anyway." A tablet said, "Memory fails. We write anyway." A city said, "Floods come, kings die, languages shift. We gather anyway." This tenderness toward impermanence may be one reason the civilization feels so alive even now. It does not present itself as invulnerable. On the contrary, the whole record of Mesopotamia vibrates with the awareness that collapse is always possible. And yet, they did not answer that awareness with despair. They answered with lists, walls, rites, schools, observations, archives, and the daily labor of keeping the world from coming apart. There is something restful in recognizing that. Because modern life often feels as though stability should be automatic, and when it is not, we experience failure. The people of ancient Sumer would have found that expectation strange. They knew stability as a practice. They knew order as effort. They knew that one clears the canal not once, but every season. Perhaps this is why their stories can feel unexpectedly comforting in the right telling. They are not tales from a perfect golden age. They are tales from a world always on the edge of disorder, in which human beings nonetheless made beauty, calculation, song, law, and reverent attention. And in that sense, they are not so far from us. Now imagine evening again. The day's heat slowly lifting. Long shadows across the walls. Workers returning. Boats moored. The market thinning. Dust settling in the lanes. A child dozing against a parent's side. The temple catching the last amber light before turning slowly into silhouette. Somewhere perhaps, in an upper chamber, a priest or scribe prepares for night observation. A lamp is trimmed. A tablet made ready. The first stars show themselves faintly in the darkening east. Below, in homes of mud brick, quiet conversations soften. Grain is eaten, water shared, doors closed, dogs curl near thresholds. Reeds whisper at the canal edges. The city exhales, and above it, the constellations rise just as they always have. The same ones that guided boats. The same ones that troubled kings. The same ones entered into lists and hymns. The same ones that looked down upon floodwater and rebuilding, conquest and lament, ceremony and sleep. The stars did not preserve the city, but they gave it orientation. Sometimes that is enough. To know where one is in relation to what endures. To know that the heavens keep their order, however fragile earthly things may be. To know that a mark made on clay in one century may still speak in another. To know that even buried cities are not wholly silent if one learns how to listen. So rest now in that old landscape a little longer. Let the plains widen in your mind. Let the canals glimmer. Let the temples stand against the sky. Let the names return in softness, not as problems to be solved, but as places in the dark. Eridu, Uruk, Ur, Kish, Nippur. Let the scribes continue their patient work. Let the kings become distant. Let the gods remain at the edge of thought, neither denied nor insisted upon, simply present as the ancients knew them, powers woven into the fabric of city, flood, authority, and fate. Let the first city dream beneath its layers of earth, and let yourself drift there without effort, where the mud is cool below the surface, where the reeds bend in the slow night wind, and where all the oldest questions sleep for a while in peace. The night deepens gently over the plains of ancient Mesopotamia. The last murmurs of the city fade into stillness, and the warmth of the day slowly lifts from the mud brick walls. Somewhere a small lamp flickers behind a doorway, its light trembling softly against woven reed mats. The canals grow quiet now, their surfaces smooth and dark like polished stone, reflecting the first bright stars that emerge above the horizon. In such a moment, the world feels suspended. The labor of the day has ended, yet the deeper movements of the universe continue quietly, as they always have. The stars begin their slow procession across the sky. Constellations familiar to watchers of every age climb steadily above the flat horizon. And somewhere high above the rooftops of the sleeping city, a careful observer waits. He does not hurry. The sky rewards patience. Perhaps he stands upon the upper platform of the temple, where the warm bricks still hold traces of the sun's heat. Beside him rests a small clay tablet and a stylus of sharpened reed. He has done this many times before. His teacher once stood where he now stands. And before that teacher, another observer, and another, stretching back through quiet generations of watchers. The city sleeps, but the work of the heavens never sleeps. A particular star rises. He notes the moment. A small mark presses into soft clay. Another observation added to a chain of memory already centuries long. This quiet continuity is one of the great hidden marvels of ancient Mesopotamia. The civilization that emerged along the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates was not simply inventive, it was persistent. Knowledge here was not treated as a single flash of discovery, but as a long conversation between generations. A student learned from a master. The student became the master. The tablet passed from one hand to another. Even when kingdoms changed, the sky remained, and those who watched it continued the work. Perhaps that is why the astronomical knowledge preserved in Mesopotamian texts feels so astonishing to modern readers. The precision embedded in those ancient records is not the result of one brilliant mind, but of countless nights of patient observation, layered one upon another, like bricks in a wall. And like the bricks of the city, these observations required care. A mistake copied forward could disrupt calculations. A missing year could blur the rhythm of the heavens. A forgotten observation could weaken the chain of understanding. So the scribes recorded carefully. Numbers were checked. Tables compared. Generations of observers quietly refined what they had inherited. The result was a body of astronomical knowledge that would eventually shape civilizations far beyond the river plains where it began. Long after Sumerian ceased to be spoken, long after the earliest temples fell into ruin, the mathematical and astronomical traditions first nurtured in Mesopotamia would travel outward into Babylonian, Greek, Persian, and later Islamic scholarship. The division of the hour into 60 minutes. The division of the circle into 360 degrees. These quiet inheritances still shape the way we measure time and space today. And yet the people who first developed these systems lived in a world that looked very different from our own. Their cities were made of mud brick rather than stone. Their roads were dust rather than pavement. Their nights were truly dark. No electric lights glowed above the horizon. No distant hum of machines filled the air. When the sun disappeared, the sky belonged entirely to the stars. And perhaps that darkness made their relationship with the heavens deeper than ours. To stand beneath such a sky is to feel the vastness of time, in a way that modern life often obscures. The stars appear eternal, yet they move slowly in patterns that reward careful attention. A watcher who studies them long enough begins to recognize their subtle shifts. A star that once rose at one point on the horizon rises slightly elsewhere centuries later. A constellation that once appeared in early spring gradually drifts into late winter. The heavens themselves change, though so slowly that only patient observers can perceive it. This phenomenon, the slow shifting of the stars caused by the precession of the Earth's axis, is one of the most subtle motions in the cosmos. And yet ancient Mesopotamian records suggest that observers here may have recognized its effects long before later astronomers formally described it. Such awareness would require not only skill, but extraordinary continuity. Records preserved, observations compared across generations, and perhaps above all, a civilization stable enough to maintain institutions dedicated to watching the sky. This is one of the quiet paradoxes of early Mesopotamia. The land itself was unstable, rivers shifting, floods arriving unpredictably, cities rising and falling. Yet within that instability emerged institutions capable of preserving knowledge across long spans of time. Temple schools, libraries, observatories, archives of clay tablets carefully stored in cool rooms where they could endure. One can imagine the interior of such a library in the late afternoon. The air warm and still, shelves lined with clay tablets arranged by category, some containing hymns to the gods, others recording land boundaries, others preserving medical instructions or astronomical tables. A young apprentice kneels beside a low bench, carefully copying an older tablet. The wedge-shaped signs must be precise. A single misplaced mark can alter meaning. He works slowly. The clay is forgiving, but the teacher is not. Across the room, an older scribe examines a tablet brought in from another city. Perhaps it contains new observations of planetary motion. Perhaps it records a rare eclipse. The scribe studies the text, comparing it with earlier records preserved in the library. Knowledge grows in such quiet moments. Not in sudden bursts, but in careful increments. Line by line, tablet by tablet. And outside the temple walls, life continues in its ordinary rhythm. Farmers rise before dawn to tend fields irrigated by canals that must be cleared again and again of silt. Boatmen guide cargo through waterways that twist across the floodplain like shining threads. Potters shape vessels on wheels that spin steadily in the warm air. Metalworkers heat copper and tin in furnaces, whose glow flickers through workshop doors. Children run through narrow streets between houses built close together to preserve shade. Merchants weigh grain, measure cloth, and record transactions that will soon become another row of wedges pressed into clay. Everywhere, the small sounds of human activity continue. And above it all rises the temple, part sanctuary, part archive, part school, part observatory. A place where the sacred and the practical meet. This union of sacred and practical thought is one of the defining characteristics of Sumerian civilization. To the people of these early cities, the workings of the cosmos were not separate from the workings of society. The order of the heavens and the order of the city reflected one another. Kings ruled because kingship had descended from heaven. Temples stood at the center of urban life because the gods were believed to dwell within them. Astronomical observation mattered not only because it revealed patterns in the sky, but because those patterns were thought to carry meaning for human affairs. A certain alignment of stars might signal prosperity. A lunar eclipse might warn of danger. A comet might be interpreted as a sign of political upheaval. Modern readers sometimes dismiss such interpretations as superstition, but they reveal something important about how ancient people understood the world. To them, the cosmos was not silent. It spoke through patterns, through cycles, through events that connected the heavens with the earth below. And the responsibility of scholars and priests was to interpret those signs as carefully as possible. In that sense, the earliest astronomers of Mesopotamia were also interpreters of meaning. They stood at the threshold between observation and belief. They watched the sky with precision, yet they also lived within a culture that saw the universe as alive with intention. This blending of empirical observation and spiritual interpretation produced a worldview at once scientific and poetic. The stars were data, but they were also messages. The moon was a celestial body, but it was also a divine presence whose phases marked sacred time. The movements of planets were measurable, but they were also expressions of cosmic order. Such a worldview may seem unfamiliar today, yet it shaped human thought for thousands of years. Even in later civilizations, echoes of this perspective remained. Greek philosophers inherited astronomical traditions from Mesopotamia. Babylonian scholars refined and extended earlier star catalogues. Islamic astronomers preserved and advanced ancient observational methods. Through these long chains of transmission, fragments of Sumerian knowledge continued to shape the intellectual history of the world. And still, the original cities slowly faded. Floods buried streets beneath new layers of silt. Walls collapsed and were rebuilt upon their own ruins. Political power shifted from one city-state to another. Languages evolved. Empires rose and fell. Yet beneath each new layer of history, traces of the earliest urban civilization remained. For centuries they slept beneath the soil. Until, in the modern era, archaeologists began to uncover them once more. The rediscovery of Mesopotamia was itself a kind of awakening. At first, the mounds scattered across the plains appeared unremarkable, low hills of earth rising from the flat landscape. But as excavations began, it became clear that each mound concealed the remains of entire cities, stacked layer upon layer. The deeper archaeologists dug, the further back in time they traveled. Brick walls appeared, temple foundations, fragments of pottery, then tablets, thousands of them. Each tablet carrying the silent voice of a civilization long forgotten. At first, no one could read them. The wedge-shaped marks seemed mysterious, almost decorative. But slowly, through patient scholarship, the script began to yield its secrets. Signs were identified, words reconstructed, languages deciphered, and with each new translation, the ancient world grew more vivid. Kings spoke again. Poets sang again. Astronomers described the heavens again. Doctors explained treatments for illness. Merchants recorded trade. Priests recited hymns to the gods. The lost civilization of Sumer began to speak, not loudly, not all at once, but gradually, tablet by tablet, voice by voice, and the story that emerged was richer and more complex than anyone had expected. This was not a primitive society struggling toward civilization. It was already a civilization of remarkable sophistication, a culture capable of building cities, developing writing, organizing large-scale agriculture, observing the heavens with precision, and preserving knowledge through institutions designed to endure across generations. How such a civilization emerged so early remains one of the enduring mysteries of human history. Perhaps the answer lies not in a single discovery, but in the quiet accumulation of many small innovations. A better irrigation method here, a more efficient way to shape bricks there, a counting system refined through generations of trade, a temple school preserving knowledge through disciplined teaching, each improvement building upon the last, each generation inheriting a slightly richer world than the one before. Civilization, like the stars above Mesopotamia, may have emerged through slow and patient movement rather than sudden appearance. And yet, even after thousands of years of research, the ancient city still holds secrets. Many sites remain only partially excavated. Thousands of tablets still wait to be translated. New technologies, satellite imaging, ground-penetrating radar, chemical analysis, continue to reveal unexpected details about how these early societies functioned. The story is not finished. Perhaps it never will be. The mud of southern Mesopotamia keeps its memories carefully. Some have been revealed. Others remain buried beneath the quiet weight of time. And perhaps that is fitting, because the earliest chapter of civilization should remain a little mysterious. It reminds us that human history is deeper and more complex than we often imagine, and that beneath the ground we walk upon today lie the layered traces of countless lives that came before, lives that built cities from mud and water, lives that watched the stars, lives that pressed their thoughts into clay so that someone, thousands of years later, might still hear them speak. Now the night grows quieter. The ancient city rests beneath the open sky. The stars continue their slow movement across the heavens, just as they did when the first observers stood upon temple terraces and made their careful marks in clay. Let those images grow softer now. Let the rivers flow gently through the plains of memory. Let the temple towers fade into the quiet distance of time. The world is still, and the oldest city sleeps beneath the earth, patient as the stars above it. The night has grown very still now. Far above the quiet plains of Mesopotamia, the stars continue their ancient journey across the sky, just as they did thousands of years ago, when the first watchers stood upon temple terraces and lifted their eyes toward the heavens. Below them, the rivers move slowly through the darkness. The Tigris and the Euphrates flow as they have always flowed, patient and enduring, winding through reeds and fields and forgotten city walls. Their waters carry the memory of countless seasons, floods and harvests, storms and calm mornings, the rise and fading of cities whose names once filled the air with life. Eridu, Uruk, Ur, Nippur. Tonight those names rest quietly in the dark soil of the earth. Their streets are long buried beneath layers of time, their temples softened by centuries of wind and sand. Yet the places themselves remain, held gently beneath the plains like old stories waiting to be remembered. Once, long ago, lamps glowed in those streets. Voices moved through markets. Boats drifted along canals under moonlight. Scribes leaned over clay tablets in the cool shadows of temple rooms, carefully pressing small wedge-shaped marks that would outlast the very cities they lived in. They could not have known that thousands of years later, those same marks would still speak, that their careful observations of the stars would still be read, that their cities would still be wondered about. But perhaps they sensed, in their own quiet way, that the world they were building mattered. Because civilization is never only about buildings or walls. It is about memory, about people choosing to preserve what they learn and pass it forward to those who will come after them. And in that sense, the ancient people of Sumer succeeded beautifully. Their cities faded. Their language slowly fell silent. But the patterns they discovered, the rhythms of the heavens, the mathematics of time, the art of writing, the careful recording of human life, continued their journey across history, carried from one civilization to another, like the slow movement of stars across the sky. Now the ancient world begins to grow softer in the mind. The temple towers blur into the distance. The canals become quiet reflections of moonlight. The distant sound of the river becomes little more than a whisper in the dark. There is nothing left to study tonight. No mystery that needs solving. The old cities are at peace beneath the earth, and the stars above them continue their patient turning. You can rest now. Let your breathing slow. Let the images of the ancient rivers drift gently away. Let the quiet plains of Mesopotamia fade into the calm darkness of sleep. The world is still. The stars are watching. And somewhere beneath the deep layers of time, the first city rests quietly beneath the earth, dreaming beneath the endless sky. Good night.